The carriage that carried Thomas Reeve up the long gravel drive of Ashcombe Hall rattled over frost-hardened ruts, and with every jolt his heart beat a little faster against his ribs. He was 22 years old, the youngest son of a tenant farmer who had died owing more than he owned, and he had precisely one trunk, one good coat, and a letter of reference folded so many times it had gone soft as cloth. He pressed his face to the window and watched the great house rise out of the mist like something out of a dream he hadn't dared to have. Gray stone, 40 windows at least, each one dark and watching, ivy climbing the east wing as though the building itself were slowly being reclaimed by the wild land around it. Somewhere beyond the gardens, a church bell told the hour, soft and far away. This is a different world, Thomas thought, and I am nothing in it. He did not yet know that within these walls he would find not just a place to work, but a reason to live, nor did he know how much it would cost him to keep it secret. Ashcombe Hall ran on rules older than most of its servants. Rules about which stairs to use, which doors to knock upon, how long a bow should be held, how a voice should never rise above a murmur in the presence of the family. Thomas learned them quickly, the way a drowning man learns to swim because the alternative was unthinkable. Below stairs, servants were a small, tight world of their own. The housekeeper, Mrs. Yarwood, sharp-tongued but not unkind. The cook, who slipped him bread when no one was looking, and a battalion of maids, hall boys, and footmen who moved through the house like a silent, well-drilled army. And there was Edmund. Edmund Fairfax was the valet to young Lord Julian Ashcombe, and from the very first morning, Thomas noticed him the way one notices a change in weather, a shift in the air before you understand why. Edmund was perhaps 28, tall, composed, with dark hair combed back so precisely it looked painted on, and eyes the color of a winter sea, gray, deep, guarded. He moved through the house with a quiet authority that even the older servants respected, and he spoke rarely. But when he did, his voice had a low, careful warmth that seemed entirely at odds with the coldness he wore like armor. "You're the new footman," Edmund said, the first time their paths crossed in the narrow servants' corridor, where the stone walls always smelled faintly of beeswax and coal smoke. "Yes, sir, Thomas Reeve." He nearly bowed out of nerves before catching himself. Valets were not to be bowed to, not by footmen, not exactly, though Edmund carried himself as though he deserved it. Something flickered behind Edmund's eyes, amusement perhaps, or curiosity. "There's no need to call me sir. Fairfax will do, or Edmund, when Mrs. Yarwood isn't listening." A faint, almost private smile touched his mouth and vanished. "Mind the third step on the back stairs, it's loose. Twisted my ankle on it my first week here 7 years ago and I've never quite forgiven it." It was such a small kindness, a warning about a stair, and yet Thomas carried it with him for the rest of the day like a coin in his pocket, turning it over and over, wondering why it felt like so much more than it was. The weeks that followed fell into rhythm. Thomas rose before dawn to black the grates and lay the fires, carried trays, stood silent and straight back through long candlelit dinners where lords and ladies discussed politics and marriage prospects as though servants were furniture with ears that didn't work. He learned the house's unspoken hierarchy, learned to disappear into a room the way the best servants could, present and invisible all at once. But always, in the corners of his awareness, there was Edmund. He noticed the way Edmund's hands moved when he brushed down Lord Julian's coats, precise, almost tender with the fabric, as though everything he touched deserved care. He noticed that Edmund ate his meals in the same chair every evening at the end of the servants' table near the window where he could watch the gardens go dark. He noticed that Edmund almost never laughed, but that when the elderly gardener told his same worn joke about the vicar and the goose, something in Edmund's face would soften for just a moment, like ice thinning over a pond in early spring. And Thomas noticed, though he tried very hard not to let himself think about what it meant, that whenever their eyes happened to meet across a room, Edmund did not look away first. It was a Tuesday in late October when everything shifted. Thomas had been sent to fetch clean linens from the box room at the top of the servants' stair, a narrow, forgotten space tucked beneath the eaves where dust motes hung suspended in the thin light from a single round window. He hadn't expected anyone else to be there, but Edmund was, standing very still amid the shelves, a folded shirt in his hands that he did not seem to be looking at. "Mr. Fairfax?" Thomas hesitated in the doorway. "Beg pardon, I didn't know anyone." "It's Edmund," he said quietly, not turning around at first. "I told you that already." Then he did turn, and there was something unguarded in his face, something Thomas had never seen there before, a tiredness, a rawness, quickly smoothed over but not quite fast enough. "Forgive me, I came up here to think. It's the only place in this house that's ever quiet." I can go, Thomas offered, though something in him did not want to. No. The word came too quickly and Edmund seemed almost surprised by his own urgency. He softened it with a small, self-deprecating exhale. No, stay if you like. I find I don't mind the company, which is unusual for me. They stood together in the dusty light, an odd, charged silence stretching between them, comfortable and impossible at once. Outside, wind moved through the bare branches of the elms, and somewhere far below, a door closed, and the ordinary sounds of the house went on without them. May I ask you something? Thomas said before he could stop himself. You've been here 7 years, don't you ever want more, a house of your own, a family, a... He stopped himself just short of the word wife, because something in the set of Edmund's shoulders told him it was the wrong word before he even said it. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped lower, careful, as though testing the weight of each word before letting it out into the room. There are things a man like me can want, Thomas, and things a man like me is permitted to have. They are not always the same list. It was the first time he'd used Thomas's given name, and it landed somewhere deep in Thomas's chest, warm and unfamiliar. He didn't fully understand what Edmund meant, not yet, not in words, but he understood the shape of it, the ache underneath it. Because he had felt that same shape inside himself for as long as he could remember, and had never once dared to name it aloud. I think, Thomas said slowly, that I understand more than you might guess. Edmund's gray eyes met his, searching, careful, half afraid. For a long moment neither of them moved. The dust turned slowly in the light between them like something suspended out of time. Be careful what you say in this house, Edmund murmured at last, though his voice had lost its edge of warning and gained something softer, something almost like hope held at arm's length. Walls have ears here, and some ears belong to people who would delight in ruining a man for far less than understanding. Then I'll be careful, Thomas said, but I won't pretend I didn't hear you. Something passed between them then, unspoken, fragile, dangerous, and utterly undeniable. It was not a touch, it was not even quite a promise, but it was a beginning the way the first gray light before dawn is a beginning before anyone has dared call it morning. Below them, a bell rang, summoning them both back to their duties, back to the roles they were required to play. Edmund set down the shirt he'd never truly been folding. We should go, he said, but at the door he paused and glanced back just once. Thank you, Thomas, for not looking at me the way people usually do when they start to suspect. Thomas did not yet know exactly what he was agreeing to, but he knew, with a certainty that startled him, that whatever it was, he wanted it. I could never look at you like that, he said simply, not you. And though neither of them said anything more, they walked back down into the ordinary noise of the house together, and for the first time since his father's funeral, Thomas Reeve felt something in his chest that was not grief and not fear, but the first trembling edge of hope. Winter closed over Ashcombe Hall like a hand. The gardens turned brittle and silver with frost, the fires below stairs burned longer into the night, and the rhythms of service grew heavier, faster, more demanding as the family prepared to host their annual Christmas gathering, a fortnight of guests, dinners, and dancing that would test every servant in the house. For Thomas, the season became something else entirely, a slow, careful unfolding. He and Edmund found each other in stolen minutes, a few words exchanged while polishing silver in the butler's pantry, a shared glance across the width of a crowded kitchen, an hour, once, spent walking the kitchen garden under a sky so full of stars it seemed wasteful for only 2 people to see it. They spoke of small things at first, books Edmund had read in Lord Julian's library when no one was looking, a song Thomas's mother used to hum while she worked, the particular ache of missing a home that no longer quite existed. And slowly, carefully, the small things became larger ones. I used to think there was something wrong with me, Thomas admitted one evening, the two of them tucked into the shadowed alcove behind the boot room, the only place in the house that seemed to belong to no one else. Candlelight from a single stub of tallow threw soft shapes against the stone. Growing up, watching the other lads look at girls the way they were meant to and feeling nothing, or feeling something but not for the ones I was supposed to. Edmund studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. And now? Now I think, Thomas said carefully, that perhaps nothing was ever wrong with me at all. Perhaps the world simply hasn't built a place for people like us yet. He glanced sideways, feeling suddenly young and foolish. People like us, is that, did I presume too much? A silence stretched, taut as a held breath. Then Edmund reached out slowly as though giving Thomas every chance to pull away and rested his hand over Thomas's on the cold stone bench between them. His fingers were warm despite the winter air, and they trembled very slightly with a vulnerability that seemed to cost him a great deal to show. You didn't presume, Edmund said quietly. You understood, which is rarer and more dangerous than you know. From that night on, something between them had been named, even if it could never be spoken aloud beyond the walls of that small, borrowed alcove. They were careful, achingly, exhaustingly careful. They never touched where anyone might see. They never lingered too long in each other's company below stairs. Edmund taught Thomas the particular choreography of concealment that he himself had spent 7 years perfecting. How to let your eyes slide past someone in a hallway as though they were a stranger. How to time a private word for the exact moment the house was busiest and least likely to notice an absence. How to love someone in a world that would call it a crime, and do it so well that no one below stairs, and certainly no one above them, ever guessed. But love, however carefully hidden, has a way of announcing itself in small and dangerous ways. It was Mr. Grimshaw, the under-butler, who first began to watch. Grimshaw was a narrow, precise man in his 40s, ambitious in the quiet, corrosive way of someone who had spent decades believing he deserved more than he'd been given. He had wanted the position of house steward for years and resented, with a bitterness he rarely let show, that Edmund, younger, better liked, effortlessly trusted by the family, occupied a place of privilege that Grimshaw felt should have been his. He did not know, not at first, what he was looking for. He only knew that something about the easy quiet between the new footman and the Ashcombe valet did not sit right with him, and Grimshaw was the sort of man who collected such feelings the way other men collected debts, patiently waiting for the day they might be called in. You spend a great deal of time with Fairfax, Grimshaw observed one afternoon, cornering Thomas in the silver pantry with the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for privacy. For a footman and a valet, odd that, different stations entirely. He's been kind to me, Thomas said, keeping his voice light, his hands steady on the fork he was polishing, as a senior servant ought to be to someone new to the house. Kind, Grimshaw repeated the word as though tasting something sour. Mind yourself, Reeve, this house has survived 100 years without scandal below stairs. It would be a shame for that record to end on your account. He left without waiting for a reply, and the threat, unspoken but unmistakable, hung in the pantry air long after his footsteps had faded. Thomas told Edmund that evening in the alcove behind the boot room, his voice tight with a fear he hadn't fully let himself feel until he said it aloud. Edmund's face, usually so composed, went very still. He suspects, he said quietly, or he wants to, there's a difference. And it matters which it is, but I'm not certain it matters enough. What do we do? We do nothing, Edmund said, though his jaw was tight and Thomas could see the effort it cost him to keep his voice even. We continue exactly as we have. We give him nothing to prove, and eventually his suspicion will starve for lack of evidence. He hesitated, then added more softly, almost to himself. I have done this before, Thomas. Not with you, never with anyone the way it is with you, but I have spent years learning how to survive being what I am in a house like this. I will not let Grimshaw take that from us. But fear, once it takes root, does not politely wait to be reasoned with. Thomas began to notice Grimshaw's eyes following him through the house, at breakfast, in the corridors, even once, unsettlingly, through the frosted glass of the boot-room door, though whether the man had seen anything at all, Thomas could never be certain. The Christmas guests arrived, filling the house with noise and light and the particular exhausting joy of other people's celebrations, and still Grimshaw watched, patient as a spider at the center of a web he had not yet finished spinning. It was Lord Julian Ashcombe himself, 26, recently returned from Cambridge, with an easy laugh and eyes that seemed to see more of his household than his parents ever had, who unknowingly changed the shape of everything. He found Thomas alone in the library one evening, sent to build up the fire before the family retired, and lingered afterward in a way that was not strictly proper for a lord to linger with a footman. You're new here, Lord Julian said, settling into a wing chair with the loose-limbed comfort of a man who had never once had to wonder whether he belonged in a room. Fairfax speaks well of you. That's rare from him. He doesn't speak well of many people. Thomas kept his eyes carefully on the fire. He's been very good to me, my lord. Something in Lord Julian's expression shifted, not suspicion exactly, but a kind of quiet, careful attention, as though he were reading a sentence written in a language he had only recently begun to learn. Fairfax has been with this family since he was a boy of 1 and 20, he said slowly. My father trusts him with everything, I trust him with everything. A pause. I should like to think that trust runs both ways. That if something were troubling him, troubling either of you, he might feel he could come to me rather than to Grimshaw or to fear. Thomas's heart beat hard and fast against his ribs. He could not know what Lord Julian intended by those words, whether they were an invitation or a trap, kindness or the first gentle turn of a screw. He chose in the end to say nothing at all and simply bowed and excused himself, and carried the weight of that strange, unfinished conversation back down into the servants' hall like a stone in his pocket. That night he told Edmund everything. Edmund listened in silence, his hands very still in his lap, and when Thomas finished, he did not speak for a long time. He's cleverer than his father, Edmund said finally, so quietly Thomas had to lean close to hear him. And kinder, I think, though kindness from a lord is still a kind of power, and power is never entirely safe however gently it's held. He turned to Thomas then, and in the low candlelight his gray eyes looked almost silver, almost afraid. I have spent 7 years making myself small enough to be safe in this house, Thomas. I don't know if I have the courage to stop. You don't have to stop, Thomas said gently, reaching for his hand in the dark, no longer caring for just this once how carefully they were meant to hide. You only have to trust that some walls might be kinder than we think, and if they're not, his voice caught, then steadied. If they're not, then whatever comes, I don't intend to face it without you. Outside, the Christmas snow had begun to fall over Ashcombe Hall, soft and silent, covering the gardens, the stables, the long gravel drive, in a hush of white that made the whole world feel for one suspended moment like it was holding its breath. Neither of them yet knew that within days Grimshaw would find the proof he had been hunting for, and that everything they had so carefully built would be tested in a single, terrible night. The night it happened, snow lay thick across the grounds of Ashcombe Hall, and the house was full of the particular hush that comes after a grand dinner, when guests have retired and only the servants remain awake, moving quietly through darkened corridors to bank the fires and lock the doors against the cold. Thomas had gone to the boot room to fetch Edmund's spare gloves, left behind after the evening's errands, and Edmund had followed a few minutes later, drawn by nothing more than the simple, dangerous wish to say good night in something more than passing silence. Neither of them heard Grimshaw's footsteps in the corridor outside, soft, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had been waiting for exactly this chance for weeks. The door opened without warning. For one frozen, terrible moment, no one moved. Grimshaw stood in the doorway, candle in hand, his thin face lit with something that was not quite triumph and not quite disgust, but a cold, satisfied mixture of both. I knew it, he said softly, I knew it. Grimshaw, Edmund began, but there was nothing to say that would undo what had just been seen, and they both knew it. The mistress will hear of this before breakfast, Grimshaw said, already turning to go, savoring the words like a man who had waited years to say them. Both of you will be out of this house by noon, and without reference, I should think, perhaps prison if Lord Ashcombe is feeling less than merciful. I understand such things happen to men like you. He was gone before either of them could answer, his footsteps fading fast down the corridor, and the silence he left behind was the loudest thing Thomas had ever heard. Edmund, Thomas's voice shook. Edmund, what do we? I don't know, Edmund said, and for the first time since Thomas had known him, his composure had entirely deserted him. His hands trembled visibly in the candlelight. 7 years, Thomas, 7 years, and one moment undoes it all. He sank onto the low bench, pressing his palms against his eyes. I have nowhere else to go, no family who would take me back not knowing this. No reference, no position, nothing. Then we face it together, Thomas said, kneeling before him, taking Edmund's hands away from his face and holding them steady in his own. Whatever happens tomorrow, you will not face it alone, I swear it. Neither of them slept that night. They sat together in the cold boot room until the small hours, speaking in low, frightened voices of what might come, of where they might go, of whether love, this fragile, hard one, entirely unspoken thing between them, could possibly be worth the ruin that seemed to be racing toward them like a train they could not outrun. Grimshaw went to the housekeeper first before dawn, certain of his victory, but Mrs. Yarwood, to his visible surprise, did not react as he had hoped. She listened to his account with a stillness that gave nothing away, and then said only, I will speak to his lordship myself. This is not a matter for you to carry to the family, Mr. Grimshaw. Return to your duties. What passed between Mrs. Yarwood and Lord Julian that morning, Thomas and Edmund never learned in full. But by mid-morning, both of them had been summoned not to the front door with their belongings, as Grimshaw had so gleefully predicted, but to the library where Lord Julian Ashcombe stood alone by the tall windows, watching the snow. Thomas's whole body felt cold as they entered, braced for the worst. "Sit if you like," Lord Julian said, without turning from the window at first. When he finally did, his expression was not the cold fury Thomas had feared, nor even simple disapproval, but something more complicated, a kind of weary, thoughtful sadness. "Mr. Grimshaw came to me this morning with quite a story." Neither of them spoke. There seemed nothing safe to say. "I have thought a great deal these past months about what kind of house I wish to run when this one someday passes to me in full," Lord Julian continued slowly. "My father built Ashcombe Hall on rules he never questioned because questioning them had never once cost him anything. I find I cannot say the same." He paused, and something almost fragile crossed his face, a private grief quickly hidden. "I had a friend at Cambridge. A closer friend than most men are permitted to have in this world we've built. He died 2 winters ago of a fever before either of us ever found the courage to say aloud what we were to each other. I have regretted that silence every day since." He turned fully to face them now, and his voice, when he spoke again, had steadied into something firm and quietly resolute. "I will not pretend the world outside these walls is kind to men like you. It is not, and I cannot change that by myself, however much I might wish to, but within these walls I find I have more say than I once believed." His gaze moved between them, grave and unexpectedly gentle. "Mr. Grimshaw will be informed that he was mistaken in what he believed he saw. He will, I think, find the position of house steward at my aunt's estate in Northumberland rather more suited to his talents than remaining here, a promotion in name though we shall both understand it for what it truly is. And you," he looked at Edmund, then at Thomas, "will remain if you wish to, discreetly, carefully, as you have been, I imagine, all along, but you need not fear this house any longer, not while I have any say in what it becomes." For a long moment, neither Thomas nor Edmund could speak at all. It was Edmund who finally found his voice, rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "My lord, I don't know how to." "Don't thank me," Lord Julian said with the ghost of a smile. "Simply live well, that will be thanks enough." He turned back to the window, to the falling snow, and added more quietly, as though speaking to someone who could no longer hear him, "Someone should in this family before it's too late to matter." Grimshaw left Ashcombe Hall within the fortnight, his resentment dressed up as ambition, his silence secured by his own pride, which could never quite admit he had lost. The servants' hall in time returned to its old rhythms, the same fires to be laid, the same silver to be polished, the same long candlelit dinners to be served in silence. But something in the house had shifted, quietly, permanently, in a way only two people fully understood. Thomas and Edmund did not announce what they were to each other, because the world of 1887 offered no safe way to do so, and they were not reckless with a happiness so hard-won. But within the walls of Ashcombe Hall, in the small hours after the family had retired, in the alcove behind the boot room that had become, in every way that mattered, theirs, they no longer had to hide from fear itself, only from a world not yet ready to see them. Years later, when Lord Julian Ashcombe married, a quiet, companionable match with a woman who understood far more about her husband's heart than society ever guessed, and asked for nothing he could not give, Edmund stood beside him as valet and in every way that counted, as friend. And when eventually, the two men who had once trembled together in a cold boot room found themselves with enough saved between them, and enough of Lord Julian's quiet, unspoken blessing, to take a small cottage on the edge of the estate's land, a home with a garden, and a fire that was truly their own to tend, they did not need to explain to anyone why two bachelors of separate stations might choose to share a roof, a hearth, and a life. The village called them old friends, the family called them loyal servants retired with honor. But in the small cottage with its crooked chimney and its garden full of roses that Thomas grew from cuttings he'd once admired in the Ashcombe grounds, two men who had found each other in a world that offered them no name for what they were, built something the world could not take away. A life, quietly and entirely their own, full of ordinary mornings and unremarkable evenings that felt to both of them like the rarest kind of miracle. On the night Edmund finally told him, decades into their life together, both of them gray now, sitting by their own small fire, that he had never once regretted the night Grimshaw opened that door, Thomas laughed, and took his hand the way he had first dared to all those years ago, in a cold Yorkshire winter that had somehow led them here. "Neither have I," Thomas said. "It was, in the end, the beginning of everything." Outside, snow was falling again, soft and silent, over a house, their house, finally big enough for the both of them.